Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. As some of you might have known, this year's Stigler Conference on Antitrust was dedicated to studying the connection between monopolies and politics. And then COVID forced us to adapt. And so we started this webinar series now with a lot of our conference speakers that are discussing many of the topics that we would hope to touch in the conference more in depth. And this is the fifth meeting of this series. In the past, we have covered South Korea, we covered Nazi Germany, we covered Imperial Japan and Israel, and we covered the US. I invite you all to check our YouTube page. It has all the videos of these past webinars. And now we are turning to Latin America today, and I'm biased because I'm from Brazil, but I think Latin America has a fascinating history for anyone interested in political economy and the connection between business and politics. Over the past many decades, we've seen the rise and fall of military dictatorships, right-wing populist governments, democracies, of course, left-wing populist governments, and even left-wing dictatorships, all in a short span and in countries that border each other. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. And I think we have a truly great panel. So Aldo Musacchio is a professor of international business at Brandeis University and the director of the Brazilian and Latin American initiatives at IBS. And he has been studying the interaction between family business and politics and state-owned business in Latin America for a lot of time. And Ben Schneider is the Ford International Professor of Political Science and the director of the MIT Brazil program. And he's also an institution in Latin American political economy, I think, has been almost everywhere. So I hope we're going to have a very lively discussion covering a range of different topics with different examples from different countries. And as we've been doing this, each speaker is going to have 10 minutes for a short presentation, and then we'll move to discussion and Q&A. We're going to have a dedicated part at the end for Q&A, but of course, if you have a question that is connected to what we're talking about, feel free to use the Q&A function in the chat. And before I turn to Ben, I just wanted to stress that I have to say that the views expressed here is everyone's opinions and not those of the Stigler Center of the University of Chicago, these usual disclaimers. So Ben, it's to you. Thank you.
I'm just sharing my screen here. There, can you see that all right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Filippo, for the introduction, and thanks to the Stigler Center for organizing this, what I consider a very important debate. What I'll try to do in my 10 minutes is a desperately brief review of the past 6 or 7 decades of the history of business politics in Latin America. It began in the 1950s with United Fruit and Banana Republics, where United Fruit, the huge multinational, was very involved in meddling in Central American government affairs, often with the help of the US government, and that gave us the term Banana Republics. Then in the 60s and 70s, the Cold War kind of intensified after the Cuban Revolution, and you saw a wave of military coups in South America in particular. Brazil, Argentina in the 60s, and then Argentina again in the 70s, along with Chile. And the photo there is, of course, the poster child of authoritarian military regimes is Pinochet with his junta in the early 70s. Business in all these cases was sort of active in demanding and soliciting the intervention of the military. And in Chile, they went so far as even before the coup, they got together with what they call in Spanish Chicago boys, economists trained at the University of Chicago, and put together a full plan that was so thick as a book that they called it the brick. So they were very involved in getting that military regime up and running. In Mexico, they call it the perfect dictatorship because they had regular elections, but only one party could win. This during the 20th century, and business was very closely intertwined with the government then. And the famous dinner President Salinas when he was leaving office in '93 and wanted support for the party campaign for the next election. And the dinner with 30 or 40 businessmen solicited 25 million each, to which the business people there readily agreed. Things started to shift though in the 70s, and there was a sort of beginning in the 80s in particular, a new wave of democratization. And you could sort of divide out whether business was involved in the move to democratize by how close they had been to the previous regime. So in Brazil, you saw an important split as business sort of cut off from the military regime in the late 1970s and came out in favor of a return to democracy. And again, many of them had been felt shut out in policymaking. In Chile and Mexico, and in contrast, the relationships were much closer. There was no rupture, and business sort of supported authoritarian rule to the end, with the important exception of the PAN, the opposition party in Mexico, but that was mostly smaller and northern business. Then we get into the 20th century. Business really stopped in sort of overt support for military intervention. The main exception, and sort of the exception that proves the rule, was the failed coup against Chavez in 2002 in Venezuela. And that's the picture there of, I think, the 3-day government of the head of the business association there. Now, there have been some constitutionally dubious ousters of leftist presidents, most prominently Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, and recently Evo Morales in Bolivia. And business, in many ways, supported this, but they certainly weren't leading the charge for those ousters. And I think a main thing that shifted from the 20th to the 21st century is capital mobility. So that with open capital accounts, the rich and the business elites in most countries in Latin America have found ways to distribute their assets where they're no longer so vulnerable to a leftist government. The other thing is that they're huge now, much bigger, so that there have been a wave of, since the 1990s, of concentration and mergers and acquisitions in Latin America. This is, in my mind, one of the ironies of what they called market-oriented or neoliberal reform in the 1990s, with deregulation and trade liberalization. Privatization was supposed to lead to much more competition. And in fact, it led to much greater competition and many markets with monopolies or oligopolies. So Chile was a leader in terms of the and is still one of the most liberalized countries in economies in Latin America. And you can see here that it's also one of the most concentrated, where the top 50 firms account for over 70% of GDP. Concentration is less great in the other large countries of the region, but it's also grown in these cases too. Now, the other thing, besides the mobility of capital and the enormous size, is that business has found that there are a lot of democratic institutions that they can use to further their interests. We've seen many millionaires run for office and successfully, at least 8. I think they're more like 10 or 12, and this all before Trump. And the man waving in the photo there is Sebastián Piñera, now in his second term as president of Chile. And I think he's the only billionaire we have in the mix. But anyway, there's been clearly a wealthy business-related candidates have done well in elections. If they aren't running, then campaign finance laws make it fairly easy to channel funds to sympathetic candidates and parties. Almost everywhere and with almost every successive election, the costs of the campaigns have increased so that, and this despite attempts in many countries to regulate that. And so in some sense, the only place that additional funding had come from are wealthy individuals and business. So even where it's regulated, there are often many ways that donors can find ways around to get resources to candidates. The other is that the media is also not very regulated, highly concentrated. Top 4 media firms account for 60 to 90% especially in TV and cable. So a high concentration there in media. One of the most egregious cases of media influence in politics came with what is known as the Televisa law. And this Televisa is one of the 2 main television channels in Mexico. And they had their lawyers draw up a bill sort of with favorable regulation that the Congress in Mexico passed in 7 minutes. And so it was very rapid and very visible sign of the influence of business in politics, in media regulation. Now there's some other areas where it's sort of harder to see exactly where business influence comes through, but that there is presumption anyway of more business influence. And that's if you take something like malapportionment, where rural areas have the votes of rural voters are worth more than those of urban voters, as it is in the United States, but often to a greater degree in Latin America. And studies have shown that there's a correlation between high levels of malapportionment and low levels of income taxes. So the idea, this is just a correlation, but the idea is that the conservative rural elites then use their leverage to keep taxes down. In a somewhat more complicated look at a political system, there's what they call majoritarian presidentialism with proportional representation in the legislature. So 2 different kinds of elections where the president's elected by majority vote and the Congress by proportional representation, as in many countries in Europe. And the proportional representation means in effect that the parties will almost always become more fragmented. And this fragmentation then offers a kind of opening for greater influence by business. And I'll give you 2 cases from Brazil. There are other countries in the region that have this kind of political system, and others more generally where the president comes to power without majority support in the legislature. And what that means, and this is where the coalitional part of the presidentialism comes in, is that presidents, in order to get votes in Congress, will trade, as in parliamentary regimes, trade ministerial cabinet positions for legislative support. And one of the ways that business then can take advantage of this, example from Brazil, is a small party called the Party of the Republic that over time came to specialize. And its specialization was that it would support whatever government came to power as long as it got the Ministry of Transportation. And once it established this reputation, then it could go to construction firms and others who had contracts with the ministry and say, support us in the election. And came to be that all of their campaign contributions came from firms with contracts with the ministry. In a broader sense, there's also, I think the most successful business lobby through Congress in Brazil is called the Bancada Ruralista, or the Agribusiness Caucus. And these, mostly in the Chamber of Deputies, these deputies come from a variety of different parties, but they come together in this caucus, and they have had something between 15 and 30% of the Chamber of Deputies. And again, they trade their votes for whatever the government wants to do, as long as when it comes to the policies that are important to them, the government supports the Bancada Ruralista. And so that's in a nutshell sort of the history. And I think in my view, big business is now quite reconciled with democracy. It's less vulnerable, as I mentioned, to left governments due to capital mobility. And it's found a number of ways to extend its influence in new democracies. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And then I think it was an excellent overview to start. Then Aldo, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you very much. This is a great way to get us started. If you hear some noise, I'm in the middle of a horrible storm here, so hopefully it doesn't interfere with the talk. I'm gonna try to share my screen as well. I just have a couple of slides to use. There you go. Hopefully you can see it. I just wanted to start by thanking Luigi Singales, Filippo Lancieri, and the entire team of the Stigler Center for inviting me. This has been my favorite webinar this semester, so it's an honor to be a guest here. And I couldn't think of a better person to do it with than Ben Schneider, who's a good friend, a partner in crime, and a mentor, and he has helped me to guide some of my thinking about the topics I'm gonna discuss today. I wanted to start basically where Ben left off and take you back to the 60s and 70s. So the context, the economic context in Latin America is that the governments are actually pursuing import substitution industrialization. They have created structures that allow them to pursue industrial policy in a way that favors some firm over others. And the financial markets are actually pretty shallow, and so there's rationing of credit. So in this context, in the 1960s and 70s, in this many of these authoritarian regimes that Ben mentioned, being close to the government favored some firms over others. So you see the rise of these very large industrial firms, and also the rise of, or the consolidation of very large business groups. And these are diversified conglomerates. And in a way, what is interesting about this period from the point of view of conglomerates is that it has some similarities with the cases of Korea and Japan mentioned before in this seminar, in the sense that, you know, in the context of credit rationing, being close to the government provided advantages to some firms, and then the government would favor those firms to venture into new industries or to develop key strategic industries. And so that contributed to strengthening even more these industrial groups. And sometimes the governments would also call on these industrial groups to bail out key enterprises in different sectors. So those contributing more to create this very sort of like big industries with high market power, usually big rents, tons of protections from foreign competition, access to subsidized credit, and the like. And so what I want to show you today, or my main point today is to actually try to bring this, to talk about what happens once these structures that are created under sort of authoritarian regimes, maybe except for authoritarian regimes in Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and maybe not authoritarian in the case of Colombia, but nevertheless, what happens when the waves of democratization and structural reforms take over in these nations in the 1990s. So the first thing that is kind of important to think about is that there are sort of like three big opportunities to sort of disarticulate, decompose, disaggregate these large business groups and maybe take some of their market power away and maybe see it more of a normalization of competition, if you may, during the 1990s and thereafter. And so what I think happens is that there are three missed opportunities. One is the democratization period in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the liberalization and sort of set of structural reforms in the 1990s, and then the introduction of antitrust. And so what is very interesting for me is that despite all of these institutional changes, and you know, if you read the recent literature on institutions, especially on democratization and how important democracy is for development, Acemoglu and Robinson literature, et cetera, you would expect that disenfranchised groups that get affected by this concentration of power in large industrial groups would actually now have channels to create some sort of counterbalancing the power of large industrial groups. Yet what we actually find is that these large industrial groups and industrial firms dominate business and politics for the decades to come. And in fact, even despite the improvement, for instance, in capital markets and in many institutions, there is no dialing back in the power of business groups and in the structures of business groups. For Chile and Brazil, we have a lot of research. I know that some of the researchers who have done some of the legwork are listening, so sorry if I don't mention your name, but we have a big body of research now on business groups in Brazil. And what we actually find is that these firms that were created during the authoritarian regimes actually survive to the democratic period, and they become lobbying machines, and they become actually really good at lobbying to have policies that allow them to keep their rents, to block, for instance, the liberalization of some sectors, to preserve certain monopolistic or oligopolistic power in some markets. And some of the firms that get more affected, like for instance, construction firms, actually develop very complex networks of corruption. And many of you probably have heard of the Odebrecht case that actually spanned over 12 countries in Latin America. One firm from Brazil that created a way of bribing its way to get the largest construction contracts in the region. And so despite the structural reforms in Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Argentina, we don't see business groups actually losing power, as Ben mentioned. For instance, despite privatization was a way, for instance, of creating more competition in these countries. And what we actually find is that the privatized industries ended up mimicking the concentration of these other industries that were concentrated in the 60s and 70s. So in the 1990s, what you see is that in telecom, in banking, in steel, in mining, in all the sectors that get privatized, you end up replicating the same structure. So in some sense, there is actually now more concentration than what you would expect. Openness to trade was also a sort of like a failed way to transform these industries, because we were expecting that foreign competition would actually sort of take some of the market power of these big players, and that didn't happen. These players were very smart to preserve their market power in non-tradable sectors, especially in services, and even in some tradable sectors. In the case of Brazil, more punctually, the sort of the big liberalization of trade never really take place, and Brazil has the highest tariffs in the region. And openness to trade didn't work, and then antitrust has not been very successful in this region. It came in late. It came in with very weak agencies at the beginning that haven't been able to look retrospectively, have focused on only a few transactions, and only lately, where some of these countries are trying to enter the OECD, have we seen major reforms and major strengthening of these agencies. The last thing I want to share, if I may, Filippo, is just a quick graph to show you how resilient some of these large firms are over time. Here, what I'm going to show is, this is only for Brazil. I'm going to show you the return on assets of the top 3 firms in these 10 or so industries from the 1970s to the 2000s. And maybe this graph is not the best, but you can sort of see that it doesn't look like there is a trend downwards in all the industries, which is what we would expect. So return on assets in Brazil seem to be high, but how do we know they're actually getting rents? That's a tough question. So what I'm going to do in the next graph is that I'm actually going to go in some of these sectors. I'm going to find the best performing firms in the US from the Fortune 500, and then compare the top 3 firms in the US with the top 3 Brazilian firms in each of these industries, just to see if the Brazilian firms compare, well or poorly with these firms in the US that are like the best of the best, you would say, in a competitive environment. And what is actually very interesting, and here I show chemical and petrochemical in the top left, food and beverage in the top right, glassworks in the bottom left, machines and engines in the bottom right, and I will show other industries. But what I want you to notice is that the green bars are the performance of Brazilian firms, the return on assets of Brazilian firms is consistently sort of like, is resilient, but it's also consistently high even compared to the performance of American firms which is kind of surprising to me. That means that either the Brazilian firms are the most innovative and sort of like best firms in these industries that can actually compete with American firms if they were competing internationally, or that they have some sort of protection, barriers to entry, and market power that allows them to charge high prices and to have high margins. The same happens in other sectors here. I show metal and steel in the top left. If you look at the bottom left, I show textiles and apparel. This is a great industry because this is an industry that gets affected really badly when you liberalize, when you lower tariffs. And you can see that in 1990, the Brazilian firms in the textile sector were struggling. But then they actually come back. And this is I think, in part what Ben was mentioning, that some of these firms learn how to survive under democratic regimes. And in fact, in Brazil, I would say what happens in the 2000s is that they learn to work very well with leftist governments, which is the kind of thing that we didn't see earlier in the century. And that became kind of like the new normal, is that these firms know how to navigate neoliberal regimes, leftist populist regimes, right-wing populist regimes. And for me, it just shows that they're actually very good when it comes to corporate political strategies. I'm going to stop here to allow for more debate. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you both for staying on time. It's always better. So I think I wanted to introduce this discussion, and we have a lot of interesting topics to discuss, but we're talking about the role of family businesses. So both of you have written a lot and extensively, I think, about how family business are that are like pervasive in Latin America, play a different role than, they might play a different role in politics than other businesses. So how do you understand that this presence of very large family conglomerates changes the firm politics dynamic in Latin America versus other continents? So I don't know if Ben, you want to
answer.
Ben.
Yeah, no, I think the role of family firms is is really important to understanding business politics in the region. I think for domestic private firms, there are not many that are widely held and sort of public shareholders and a few by private equity, but the vast majority are family held. And there's an interesting story about Carlos Slim, who has the largest business group in Latin America. And once when asked why he was amassing such a fortune, he said it's to create a dynasty. I want this to last for generations. And he does have many of the next generation, by one calculation, sort of 14 of 20 top positions were held in his empire by relatives, sons-in-laws, cousins, and so forth. I think the families, when they get the family businesses into politics, two things change compared with the sort of what we would think of as more of a standard corporation. One is the intensity of interests. So if you're thinking of interacting with a government who might be threatening, then it's going to be much more threatening to business owners who think of their firm as like a dynasty, as opposed to shareholders and corporate and professional managers. The second thing that's different from other firms is time horizons. CEOs of public companies come and go, but the families are in it for the long haul. So when they engage with the politician, for example, contributing to a campaign, they are there then to monitor the behavior and to sanction or reward that in subsequent elections. So I think that's important. It also allows the family business to sort of extend members into politics. And it was in fact just this morning that I read that the son-in-law of an owner of a television conglomerate in Brazil has just been nominated as the Minister of Communications. So this allows, you can outpost family members to different parts of the political system.
Yeah, so they're like the feudal lords in the past, when they have a son in the clergy, a son in the military, and one son was like the landowner or something. Aldo, what's your take on that?
I mean, I think Ben captured what I think would be my main reaction. I just want to add one important dimension. That is, I think it would be an error to think of these families as sort of like more cowboyish families of the past in dealing with governments. These are very professional families. So something that I've noticed in Latin America in the last 15 years or so is the professionalization of the family firm. Sort of like, it's not like you're leaving the firm just to your kids. Now your kids are all trained in top schools and the like. But the second one is the professionalization of the corporate political strategies. Some of these firms have very sophisticated lobbying firms that allow the families to actually interact with different regimes and the like. And this is where I think the understanding that in Latin America, to survive as a large firm, you have to be able to deal with a military dictatorship, with a neoliberal democratic regime, with a populist left-wing regime, and then again with a right-wing regime. It's complicated, and that's why I think these firms have become very professional in the way they manage all of these relations.
Yeah, I think this really ties in well to I think the next question that I wanted to address, and I think it's completely connected to this. So Aldo is writing a new paper now that he was kind to share with me, and he's talking about what he says, insider capitalism. And then he has a quote that's connected to this. He says that large business groups learn how to survive periods of macroeconomic instability by obtaining financial support and protections from the government. And Ben has an excellent book as well on this topic. You should check it out, on hierarchical capitalism in Latin America, where he mostly agrees with this statement. But Ben, I think you also say there that you cannot get too close, that you have a lot of stories of business groups that got too close and got burnt when there was because there are so many political transitions. So I wonder if you, I think now starting with Aldo and then going to Ben, if you can elaborate a bit more on like, what are the specific strategies that this business use to stay aligned with government? How do they navigate these transitions? Like, how do you see this coming?
Yeah, I think just in line with what we were saying in the previous conversation, that if your strategy is a long-term strategy, sort of like you're a family, your discount rate is about how am I going to maximize the wealth of like the next, X number of generations. You don't want to just sell yourself to one politician or one regime. I think when you see that happening, it's more like the new and up and coming companies that sort of like gamble everything on one sort of political regime, like the Ike Batista example with Lula. In Mexico with Enrique Peña Nieto, there was like the construction company IGA that actually also just bet everything that they were going to do very well with them. And you have this sort of kind of like up and coming companies that really gamble everything, and those are the ones that end up losing when there is a transition.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yes, I tried to identify in the book what I called the Icarus business groups, where they really got too close to the sun and then flamed out and crashed. One of and Aldo's exactly right on this, that there are sort of more traditional, longer standing business groups that will sort of stay on the sidelines, and that you saw, for example, in Brazil in the 1970s, with the government pushing a lot of new import substitution, and some firms really going gung-ho on that, whereas Votorantim, a much older sort of by then second generation firm, really kept its distance from the government and came out much better in the end as compared to some of those, like Vilares was a classic example of too close to the sun. Same in Chile in the first round of privatizations in the 70s. There were a couple of big business groups that sort of gobbled up everything in sight, but then ultimately came to a financial crash in the early 80s, and those groups disappeared, whereas the longer standing family business groups sort of chugged along and came out on top, and buying up the pieces of these earlier empires. So I think to some degree that this is sort of this pendular move in Latin American policies, with sort of extremes to import substitution, to liberalization, and back and forth, and firms sort of riding that wave. I think that pendulum is sort of narrowed the range of variations so that firms, it's easier to navigate the changes in policy as opposed to the late 20th century.
Okay, I think that we're starting to get questions already, so I think I'm gonna. So Luigi has a question that connects to this, so I'm gonna ask this. He's asking to Aldo, but I think Ben can say that if you can elaborate more on this strategy of local elites to move into utilities, whether this is very common in Latin America as it was common in Italy, because it would seem that utilities are kind of a more protected business that would be less subject to this pendulum of liberalization versus statization, but at the same time. For example, in Brazil, utilities were the first groups to be really privatized, even though you still have very high tariffs for steel, you had the privatization of utilities. So how do you see this strategic positioning of which business they choose to enter and to exit in order to protect their rents and their strategies?
That's a complicated question. The countries that I know best for utilities are perhaps Brazil, Mexico, and maybe a little bit of Colombia. In Colombia, I think it's like the best regime where actually sort of business elites took advantage of privatization, created a system that has mixed ownership, but it's mostly controlled by private firms, and they created a very good regulator, and that has actually created, it's probably one of the best operated utility sectors, especially energy sectors, power sectors in Latin America. In the case of Brazil, the elites that got into bed with the government in the partially privatized electricity firms, I think have been burned a little bit. The same happened, I think, in Bolivia, where like some foreign partners got expropriated basically in some of their concessions. And then the latest sort of case is the case of Mexico, where in the previous regime, they did a sort of a reform that allowed private independent power producers to sell energy to the grid using a variety of ways to generate the energy. And just a couple of weeks ago, the president of Mexico decided to basically cancel all the contracts and just got burned investors from all over the world. So in a way, the utility sector is one of the sectors where you're going to find the most interesting heterogeneity across the region in terms of how difficult it is to protect your interest. Some multinationals, like the Spaniards, are very good at and have managed to keep most of their concessions throughout the region, but others, especially American investors, have been burned badly.
Yes, in some famous cases with local partners. But Libby, I mean, I think it's worth taking a step back and saying there has been a lot of movement of business groups into utilities, but it's interesting to take a look back in the period of trade liberalization, because many of the policymakers and observers said, "Oh, trade liberalization is going to be impossible because so many firms are, depend on these protections." In the event, there was very little opposition. It's partly because diversified business groups, they're diversified. So they sort of moved out of import competing industries and moved more of their assets into non-tradables. And utilities was one of the great places to be in that sense. I think it's worth highlighting too that Carlos Slim, come back to him, the largest business group, started out with the telephone monopoly of Mexico, sort of used that then to generate rents that increased and invested all over Latin America. In Chile, there was a very interesting interview with one of the managers of Grupo Mate, and Mate is one of the old style, long-standing family firms. And he said that the conglomerate had decided they wanted to slim down and they wanted to concentrate on just 4 or 5 sectors, but highly regulated sectors. So I think there's a clear sense in that sort of strategy that they're increasing returns to investment in politics and contacts with regulators. So that can be in itself become a firm strategy.
Okay,
there is I was just going to add, there is a less well-known firm. from Colombia. It's called Grupo Gea, Empresas Públicas de Medellín, which is a state-owned firm, partially privatized, that now operates water companies, water utilities all over Central America and all the way to Mexico. So they figure out how to manage relations to operate these firms, and now they're expanding in the Caribbean as well, I think.
Yeah, it's very interesting for sure. And I think it's interesting to notice in Latin America that a lot of families don't only have utilities, right? So they own a lot of businesses, then they also own the power plant generator that distributes the grid, or they also own the railway that moves the steel around. So it's not only, they're not like specialized, like, oh, we only have electricity company. Like, I think this diversification is interesting. But I think this ties towards something that I also wanted to explore, which is how do they navigate this different political coalition, right? So the political coalitions that supported maybe you can tell me if that's true or not. Do you think that the political coalitions that support the military dictatorships in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they're definitely not the same political coalitions that supported left-wing governments during the same periods? No? So like you go from, I don't know, Perón government to military dictatorship or things like these, or Allende to military dictatorship. And then you have democratization, then you have left-wing populism in 2000. So how do you see the coalitions that support these different governing structures? And how do you see the business navigating the shifts, in the sense that like they cannot get too close, but they have to be close enough? It's a very interesting dynamic. So I'd love to have your take on that.
You want to start, Aldo?
No, I was gonna let you start then.
Okay, I'll jump in then. Yeah, no, I think there are a couple of things going on, and it surprised people when, you know, sort of what they called the pink tide, with the wave of left governments that came into office, elected in the 2000s, and I think certainly business was apprehensive. You saw in the lead up to one of the early elections was for Lula in Brazil in 2002, and there was a very large and expanding sort of spread in the bond market where investors were very worried about what Lula might do once in office. And he sort of, he dealt with it in a number of ways. One, by saying he was sort of Lula light, that he wasn't like the old radical he had been. He wrote this letter to the people where he promised not to do anything too disruptive. And in the end, got along very well with business. So I think business has an ability and a flexibility to deal with a lot of these regimes. It was more difficult of course, in the cases, they split the left in Latin America in this period between the radical and the sort of more moderate left, Lula being prominent on the moderate side, along with Bachelet in Chile. The more radical left in Bolivia, in Ecuador, certainly in Venezuela, posed a bigger challenge, and Venezuela, as we know, just unraveled. In Ecuador and Bolivia, in fact, though, much more radical and threatening presidents there ultimately came to sort of accommodation with business. So in no case do we see, outside of Venezuela, really frontal attack on these business groups, on big business in general. So in the end, it was a pretty congenial atmosphere.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to what Ben said, I mean, what for me is very interesting in terms of these coalitions is that some of the same kind of industrial coalitions that you saw perhaps supporting the dictatorships in the 70s, let's say, have found that it's easier to work with leftist populist governments than with neoliberal regimes. No? And obviously the best example is the case of Brazil, but also if you look at Mexico now under President López Obrador, sort of the leftist populist variety, a lot of the large industrial groups from Monterrey and even Carlos Slim have found him to be easier to deal with because he's a nationalist than to perhaps deal with what happened in the 90s, where, like, you know, we had our version of the Chicago boys trying to liberalize everything in Mexico, and they really wanted competition, and they didn't want to reproduce what we had in the 70s. So it is kind of interesting that the coalition, which was probably right-wing, that supported many of these dictatorships in Latin America, then learned to work with sort of like the other extreme down the road. And you find this even, for instance, in Venezuela, which is the extreme case. If you look at the banks, the bankers have not been expropriated in Venezuela. And there's a reason why, because they've learned to deal with, first with Chavez and later on with Maduro. The same in Nicaragua. I was there before things started to get crazy. And the banks also have been very good at operating in this sort of more nationalist, populist, leftist regime of Daniel Ortega. So there are some interesting ways in which the fact that these businesses learn to create coalitions that can swing so much, for me, is something that makes Latin America unique right now.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think this ties into to my final point, and then I'll move more. We already have a lot of questions to answer. That what are the mechanisms through which these businesses navigate all of these? So Ben has a good quote in his book that says that business did not design the electoral systems, but they did bring systems down. And Aldo was talking about, and he was talking about the media and the power of owning media. And Aldo, you're talking about corruption and revolving doors and donations and things like this. So do they still have a credible threat that if their interests are too threatened, they'll just bring the whole system down, and that's how they maintain? Do they leverage their political donations and media conglomerates to try to influence and shape public opinion? So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about through what mechanisms, and then we have another question here from Luigi connecting to the media. If the introduction of new media can be a disrupting factor that's going to start breaking this equilibrium that has been for a very long time, and like I think that we see through here. So I'll let Aldo start.
Oh, okay. I mean, it's a complicated question, but the answer is multi-dimensional. And maybe I should let Ben start. Ben, I'll follow your cue.
Okay. I would say that, well, I don't know exactly within business groups, but I imagine that they would be thinking less about how would I bring this regime down, and more about if this regime if it becomes unmanageable here, where else can I do business? So I think that everybody has sort of a built-in exit strategy. And this, I would point out that this also gives business leverage, because the leftist president, knowing that business might leave or move its investment, then has a much greater incentive to make things more attractive for these investors. And you can see, you see a lot of these companies, even the more traditional business groups, expand their investments, mostly in the rest of Latin America. So they're called the multi-Latinas, and there's been some very good work by Diego Finkelstein, among others, on this. So I think that's one thing, is that they have that option. The other thing is I sort of recommended viewing business politics or business strategy in politics like a portfolio, that businesses sort of invest, they can invest in lots of different areas of politics. And they can do so in a way that's flexible and adjusting to changes in governments or across countries. So for example, businesses very well organized in formal business associations in Mexico and in Chile, and surprisingly disorganized in Brazil and Argentina. So businesses in Mexico and Chile invest a lot more in those business associations that mediate a lot of their interactions with government. Revolving doors, it's sort of, Colombia is probably the regional, possibly world leader in this, that have, the careers are typically built by moving in and out of the private and public sectors, by ambitious, well, I wouldn't call them bureaucrats because they're moving between the two. So it's ambitious individuals. Last, I think the campaign and the media seems more constant across all cases. So that would be less variation and useful in sort of all situations.
I was going to say, so sort of like thinking about the enforcement mechanisms is what is hard, because clearly most of these elites, except maybe now in Bolivia and in Venezuela, they've abandoned the idea of like organizing a coup to overthrow a government. And so how do you actually do it without that? I think you're going to see that a lot of these groups have very sophisticated lobbying strategies in which they create their own blocks in Congress. This is very clear, for instance, in Brazil or in Mexico, where you know, if you're messing with, let's say, one of the media moguls, they actually have a block in Congress that they can mobilize also to sort of play ball in their favor and against the regime. There's capital flight, as Ben said, so most of these, the largest industrialists now are diversified internationally, so it's very easy for them to move capital around and maybe suspend some investments. You know, Carlos Slim can suspend investments in Mexico and expand his operations in South America, no problem. The other thing that, for instance, in Chile, we have now a lot of research by for instance, Marcelo Buccelli and Erika Selvage, is that they've learned to use boards of directors to survive different transitions very well. And so if you look at the boards of directors from the 80s to today, you see that sometimes they use strategies where you may have a former general, but also a former guerrilla member in your board, depending on who wins. And when Bachelet wins, maybe you want the former guerrilla to be your liaison. And then when you have a right-wing government, maybe you have a conservative person, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry to take that long, Filippo.
No, not at all. I think it's a very interesting discussion. And I think that there's a very interesting question here by Marcelo Buccelli, who's asking, I think, a piece of the missing puzzle, which is, what do we think of multinationals, and whether we have examples of multinationals that also learn how to play this game and negotiate radical left governments in countries like Venezuela and Bolivia and Brazil as well. So how do you see multinationals entering these markets? Where do they enter, and if they also play the same game as domestic firms?
I mean, we've been mentioning a few examples just in the last couple of comments. Slim, for me, is like a great example of someone who knows how to navigate any regime anywhere in Latin America. Obviously, the Brazilian construction companies taught us some lessons of how to deal with different regimes through corrupt means. And then for me, since Marcelo is from, he's partly Colombian, there are some interesting cases out of Medellin of firms that have learned to navigate, you know, very complicated, highly regulated sectors, like operating water utilities, maybe electricity, banking, and insurance. And now they've expanded to Central America, the Caribbean, even they're operating in Mexico now.
But what about what about non-family firms? What about like when these gigantic US multinationals or European multinationals enter these countries? And then do they kind of like try to coalesce around local players and leverage on their interests as well and be kind of aligned? Do they play a different game? Do they enter different markets and try not to compete? So how do you see like these like major American firms coming to Latin America?
They definitely learn. I mean, there are horrible examples and then like best practices examples. I don't know which ones we want to go to, but like for instance, there's a really nice research coming out of the Reconciliation Commission in Brazil, looking at the dictatorship, and they found, for instance, how Volkswagen cooperated with the dictatorship to actually torture people and to actually locate workers who were leading some of the anti-government protests and things like that. And then there are tons of examples like IBM in Argentina and Mexico bribing everyone and their mothers and things like that. But then you probably have also examples like the ones I mentioned, the Spanish multinationals that learn to operate utilities in very different regimes, and they know how to navigate the political regimes. There's a company in Spain that actually has been very good at doing partnerships, even in state-owned enterprises. They're very good at partnering with the government across countries in Peru and in Chile, et cetera, et cetera. So you have sort of the two extremes and Marcelo could perhaps even give us some examples if he was live.
Is it okay if I share that slide again?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Just to show that, again, the orange here are the multinational corporations. So you look at the top 50 firms or the top 100, and it's usually 15, 20, up to 25%. And Argentina is, of course, huge. So if you're thinking of big business in Latin America, multinationals should be on the radar. But I think, I mean, Aldo mentioned this, in some cases, they've been very good sort of behind the scenes, under the table, that they can, well, you take the case of Odebrecht throughout Latin America, done very well at that. But in more visible politics, they're less prominent. So if you get to business associations or statements of in the media, multinationals tend to shy away.
Okay, and then I think that we haven't talked at all about reform. So we have a very good question here from João Guedes, who's saying that Brazil has a very distinctive that just introduced a ban from campaign donations to private firms and also introduced public funding to reforms. And actually, it's impressive how quickly the public funding grew, as you would expect. Once you give a lot of money to politicians, it ballooned very quickly. But anyway, this comment aside, do you see this as an avenue for reform to try to break this relation, or is it just another encouragement for corruption? Like, how do you see these types of reforms in the electoral system playing out?
I think both Ben and I are going to give you the same answer. Ben, it's it.
You can try to speak at the same time.
I totally see this as a way of creating what Brazilians call caixa dois, which is the legal way of supporting campaigns. In a way, what I think I liked about the Brazilian system is that at least there was some transparency. Now there is really like, you don't know what is going on behind the backstage. And in other countries, like in Mexico, this has been a huge problem because campaign donations don't exist the way they existed in Brazil. So everything happened always in secret, and then suddenly it would come out. I think Ben mentioned one of those dinners in the 90s that were very famous. And we still have things like that going on I think in like 2 months ago, there was a dinner the same way in Mexico where you just have to donate, I don't know if it was $1,000, $10,000, $100,000 per seat to be in a dinner with all the industrialists. And I much rather have some transparency than nothing.
Yeah, no, definitely. I would agree. I think transparency is the way to go, particularly on the campaign contribution. I think if you have what is clearly high demand and increasing demand on the part of politicians for resources for campaigns, then the money is going to flow somehow, and it's much better if you know how it's flowing than if it's hidden. I mean, you might then say, well, let's take some moves to reduce the cost of campaigns. And some of that has been tried. Brazil, as you know, has some famous or infamous sort of electoral hour where, all TV stations have to show ads from the politicians. And in the beginning, this was thought of as a way to reduce the amount of money you needed because you don't need to pay for the airtime on television. But it turned out that over time, the parties and candidates wanted to produce ever more expensive little showlets that they could put on the electoral hour, that they ended up spending huge amounts of money for this free airtime. So it's just an example of how money will sort of creep in many ways. The other way to think, if you can't reduce the amount of spending, would be to try and channel it through parties. If parties were stronger, then I think that would limit or reduce the amount of direct business person to capital to politician links. But reforming parties and making them stronger may be even more difficult. So I would lead first with transparency. I mean, the other thing is that would be to try and reduce some of the size and concentration of business. And here I think antitrust is crucial. And I think there have been big strides in Latin America, but I think it's still, most agencies and most policies in most countries are too weak at the moment to really limit the growth of business in that way.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, I was bombarded as a kid with very bad political ads, so I can relate to seeing like it was always a prime time. You have like prime time and everything. But I think we're going to the end. We have a lot of questions here. I think I'm going to ask one final question that is going to lead to a bigger reflection, and we can also discuss on antitrust, which I agree with all of you that we need the concentration, and yet a lot of the policies are creating national champions. So we have from Rodrigo. Rodrigo is asking about power symmetries between big business and government, so it's connected to this. He asks if we can identify some conditions where the government has more power to harness the economic power of business, like state capitalism. Is this a good way to move forward as a way to embed the power of business and the states? Or there are other conditions in which it's the other way around, in which like business are so much more powerful than the government that they kind of like capture the government. And I think, what are your thoughts on this?
I have thought a lot about this question, and so I thank Rodrigo, and I've thought about this question with Rodrigo, if that's the Rodrigo that I'm thinking of, in the sense that the problem in Latin America of harnessing the power of government. I mean, in some countries, you can think of like really amazing ways in which you could harness the power of government to create, interesting outcomes. The problem is the political economy, right? Like that anything that can be used for good can also be used for evil if it's captured. I mean, we're in the Stigler Center. This is like the kind of thing you guys think about all the time. And so I think what the people who have looked at this, I've done research on Brazil, and we always find like, oh, they've done this thing, this is amazing. And then we're like, oh, but in this other instance, like the BNDES, the Development Bank, they use it to invest in capital in some firms, and those firms actually use that capital to do great things. But then when it comes to loans, which are actually bigger, it turns out that they tend to be correlated with campaign donations, and they're not used for very productive things, but just to pay less interest and things like that. So it's a double-edged sword. In the case of Mexico, it's very interesting because every time I've discussed this with government officials, they're very worried that anything that might look like industrial policy in that sense could be captured and be used for evil. And in general, that's actually what happens if you look at Mexico. Like the bailout of the banking system in the 90s was like one of those examples where it was something that was well-intentioned, but then it was obviously ended up benefiting the banking elites. Yeah, I'll leave some room for Ben to contribute.
Perhaps a little more optimistic note. I mean, I think the asymmetry is here to stay. So particularly for smaller countries, they're dealing with, even their domestic firms are much larger than they were in the past. And so that, I think, particularly through the electoral route is always going to be a present danger. But I see some examples in Latin America of more successful regulation. And here the idea is you take the regulatory body out of the regular administration, you give it, staggered terms for the members, you give a sort of career track for professional staff and so forth. And I think Brazil has done this in a couple of areas. One that I've seen recently is the health regulator for drugs, Anvisa, has worked well with business and resisted sort of pressures from them. And I think, and going back to the antitrust, I think that, you see the agencies sort of gradually getting the power for dawn raids, for other investigative tools, for leniency agreements to get one cartel member to rat on the others and so forth. And you see them sort of accumulating institutional and bureaucratic capacity. So I would hold out some hope there.
Always good to end to be hopeful, and I think that this touches a topic that we didn't cover. I mean, there are a lot of questions that we have to finish now. This was a fascinating discussion, but it touches also on the role of public servants and the specific role that they play in ensuring that the government works well, and also the incentives that they have, and this changes a lot. I worked a lot with CADE, for example, in Brazil. That's very good And CAGI has very specific incentives for employees to continue there. Like one of the things that CAGI has kind of without, not on purpose, I guess, is that CAGI doesn't have its own technical body. So it mostly gets employees from other ministries, which means that it can kind of hire and fire employees within the administration. It doesn't have this very strict career. And so this is a way to keep people productive, and the personnel of CAGI is perfect. They're very good at it. But anyway, that's a side discussion for another day. I wanted to thank you both for, I think, was a very lively and very interesting panel. I learned a lot, and on behalf of the Stigler Center, thank you everyone also who connected for watching. So until next time in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good to see you, Aldo.
Thank you.